Hey everyone, it's Ryder, and I hope you're telling your loved ones how much you appreciate them. With the release of subclassing, thousands of combinations of skills are possible, and each carry their own value, but determining how they pair together can be like walking into a grocery store and picking three unrelated items and trying to make a dish out of it. Like anything else in life, if the information is compartmentalized and boiled down to the basic components that comprise each skill line, making the right choice for your build can become a much less daunting process. We can begin by sorting the skill lines by their primary function. The skill lines displayed on screen carry secondary and tertiary tools as well, like Dawn's Wrath carrying an execute, but delving into every ability and its use would undermine the goal of making the process easier. Instead, treat these features as additional tools once the groundwork for your build has been laid on. On the right, I provided a legend for the symbols placed on each ability, and these correspond to my theory crafting video. If you haven't watched that already, pause this video and watch that, as this video is further context to that information. The symbols reflect the checklist that I discussed during that video as well, and this image can be used in conjunction with that checklist to ensure all necessary parts of a build are accounted for. If you have no idea where to begin, I recommend securing a resolve buff, of which has an additional effect or skill line passives that you enjoy. For example, if I don't know where to begin, but know I like to play a Sorcerer as my base class, I can use Storm Calling to provide my resolve, and I have a stun, so those are two boxes checked off the list. As you work through this process on your own, have a physical or digital list in front of you that you can continually reference. Much of theory crafting can seem like a headache simply due to poor organizational skills. Stay focused and have an objective to accomplish. Before I delve into each skill line, refer back to the idea of the damage spectrum, in that, on one end, you can have a build become very tanky with little damage, or the opposite, which can be more associated with a glass cannon. Broadly speaking, picking 3 damage lines will yield more of a glass cannon, and 3 defensive lines will make dying nearly impossible. The fineness of this argument falters upon closer inspection within the variabilities for each build, but you can use this as a general guideline to predict where your build is on that spectrum. The next segment will provide commentary on the synergies between each skill line based on their general intended directions. The categories, like the previous image showed, is based on my interpretation, and while others may display these differently, I'm confident that the end results would look the same. On your screen, I provided a table that separates the skill lines based on their primary function. When you're deciding which skill lines to pick from, consider a few rules to follow. First, the more lines you pick from one category, the more specialized your build can become, but this also needs the support of your set lineup. If we use all 3 critical damage lines, for example, we should use sets and other bonuses that lead us into critically striking more often. If we instead go for a lower critical chance, we're not optimally using the skill line selected. The second rule is to understand that the more specialized we are, the stronger our direct counter will be. If we're using all critical damage lines and we're against a player using Farstrider and Rallying Cry, our damage immediately drops significantly. This isn't to say the fight is unwinnable, but when creating your build, you must be honest with your weaknesses to play more effectively against other players. The final rule is to understand that the skill selection is only half of a build and that the gear you select is equally important. Even when selecting multiple defensive lines, one can output high amounts of damage with the right gear, so while this is a strong general guidance to gauge where your build is on the damage spectrum, understand that this table does not contextualize finer details that comprise a build. Now that we better know the rules to follow when reading this information, we can analyze the relationship between each decision. In ESO, there are many factors that go into your damage calculation, including penetration, critical chance and damage, spell and weapon damage, and other flat increases from either buffs, sets, or champion points. Like anything else in the game, the more generalized your approach to damage is, while you may yield versatility, you'll lack specialization and overall present less damage. This leads us to the point of paths to damage, which is the avenue used to increase outgoing damage. The image on your screen demonstrates this idea, and you should use this metaphor as a way of keeping yourself focused and not to spread out your damage types. If you, for example, used the Thief Mundus, some penetration, some spell damage, and a set that can't critically strike, your damage will be far behind those specializing into one path. If I, For example, I'm using a set that offers high critical chance and damage, like Order's Wrath, and are using critical damage lines like Assassination, my build is best optimized to continue into this path of critical damage, and I should keep hunting the increases to this stat. While penetration might offer some assistance with the kill, if you were to run the math on which path would present the highest outgoing damage, you would find that sticking to one path will give the most output. Most PvPers intuitively understand this, and you'll see many builds online going into one of these avenues. There are cases, however, where splitting your damage paths actually yields more favorable outcomes than sticking into one. On one of my critical damage builds, I use Aedric Spear, Animal Companions, and Restoring Light. My path to damage is fastest when using critical damage sets like Mechanical Acuity or Order's Wrath, and I make sure my critical chance is high with either the Shadow if I'm using Acuity or Thief if I'm using Order's Wrath. To support this choice, I also use Onslaught, which grants around a 35% damage increase for 5 seconds by giving us 100% penetration. In this case, there would be no way for my build to incorporate such a large damage boost if I only continue to use critical strikes. And so, when you're making this decision of which path to take or lean into, you must break down the game's components into comparable percentages. Because I could not achieve 35% more critical damage as easily as I could with 100% penetration, I chose to use Onslaught. Mathematics in ESO is really easy to perform as all values can be broken down into a percentage. The only research required is to find the conversions online, of which there are many sources for. Before we go further, however, we must evaluate the previous example and place this next to important context. Most sets in the game, whether they're raw damage increases such as Essence Thief or Oak Fathers, can be paired with most other damaging options and are comparable to around 80% effectiveness as a non-selective damage setup. So, if you're not looking to squeeze out every number for a build, you certainly don't have to, and especially so if you plan on using Torque of the Ayleid King. The critical damage lines pair exceptionally well together, as the further you lean into a particular path of damage, as I said, the more effective your damage becomes. Players may intuitively understand that as many duelers in Stormhaven choose to take 2 or even all 3 of these lines together. More often, however, they will pair 2 critical damage lines with 1 line from any other category, but I commonly see either dot or hybrid sections selected the most often. By selecting 2 critical damage lines and other damage or hybrid line, players can assert unstoppable aggression onto an enemy, often killing them before a retaliation can occur. If these make up 2 or more of your total skill lines, commit further into critical chance rather than raw damage. The dot and pressure lines are less friendly with their choices, and should actually consider what sets they're using at the same time as selecting their other lines. If you're using sets that can't critically strike, you wouldn't make the most out of any other critical damage lines. If you are using these lines, pay close attention to your passives, and be even more attentive to which status effects you're applying and which ones you're not. The more status effects that are applied onto an enemy, the weaker cleanses become, and because this is the counter to your build, you'll want to reduce its effectiveness as much as possible. Hybrid lines refer to skill lines that have many tools and are universally strong in PvP, but that line doesn't specialize in any one set. They may offer stuns, bursts, damage over time, mobility, or resolves all within the same line. I wouldn't recommend many of the hybrid lines to be run together, as while each one adds many tools to a kit, those tools need to connect to a precise goal, rather than adding a general but undirected list of utility. Some of these lines are more damage-oriented, while others offer a level spread across the spectrum. So, while they may be grouped together, their implementation will vary. The damage and utility lines should act as additions to an idea you have, rather than being the sole focus of your objective. On their own, these lines can't achieve any win conditions, excluding a base class Nightblade using Soul Cleaver set, of course. In their own way, the damage and utility lines offer a tool to immediately assist your win condition, whether that's by offering more sustain, bursts, or stuns. These lines can't be thrown into a build without consideration to what your build is first lacking. Damage reduction refers to skill lines that offer raw mitigation or have passives that allow surviving higher amounts of burst. Each of these offers defensives in their own way, and I encourage you to pay close attention to their parts in the video. In short, each have their own minigame to create an effect. Winter's Embrace, for example, can maim melee opponents, whereas the Soldier of Apocrypha line plays with Crux. These 4 skill lines can dictate a playstyle just by themselves, and you should ask yourself how you envision your survivability in combat. The healing lines, excluding Restoring Light, offer raw healing output that are mostly used to support allies in combat. While less important within the current critical damage meta, healing is still a key part of group fights, and groups with a portion of their players using these trees can greatly promote team viability. The final segment before the monograph of class skills will provide a demonstration of how to evaluate your build before you sink a lot of gold into it. On your screen, you'll see a blank worksheet that we'll fill out with some examples. If you're new to PvP but are frustrated with how confusing making your own build can be, I recommend screenshotting and saving this image as a blank template to then work over, as this can reduce the mental strain induced by juggling sets of information. On the left, we have the necessary checklists that I mentioned in my theory crafting video. On the top, we have 3 slots, each for us to put a skill line in. At the bottom, we have our damage spectrum, and we'll use the 3 Venn diagram image to orient our position there. For each survivability line we select, we move 1 space to the right. And for each damage line we take, we move 1 space to the left. The 3 true hybrid lines will not move our spot at all. Let's take a look at our first example. So we have Aedric Spear, Animal Companions, and Assassination selected, all of which are damage lines. On the bottom, you'll see that our spot moved all the way to the left, as this damage comes at the lack of survivability. Taking a look at our checklist, we're missing a few crucial buffs. Fortunately, we can account for this, but we'll need to make some sacrifices, like running Chewed On for a monster set. On the front bar, we'll need to secure Major Prophecy and Savagery, but because we're using both Magicka and Stamina skills, we can't use a weapon or spell power pot. To fix this, we need to fit Camo Hunter on the front bar. For our burst heal, none of our lines give us access to this, but with the addition of Scribing, we can patch this issue with Wield Soul as a heal. We'll review 2 more scenarios for the sake of practice. These are the 3 skill lines I selected at random, but it doesn't actually look all that bad. The build leans heavily into dots and debuffs and can probably deal a lot of damage, but we're missing a few crucial buffs that we need in an open world setting. To start, we're lacking a Major Breach, but fortunately this is one of the easiest holes to fill with Elemental Susceptibility. Without a stun, opponents can heal away our dot damage, so we should consider Wield Soul to be a stun instead of a burst heal. The final weakness of the setup involves a lack of mobility. We'd have to sacrifice our jewelry traits for Swift, and an additional slot for Race Against Time for mobility, but without this, we'd quickly get run down by more than 2 opponents at a time. I'd expect this build to have favorable survivability, but it lacks the tools to secure kills without either the opponent making mistakes or another person helping you. The final example also includes a build of randomly selected skill lines. The build uses all 3 true hybrid lines and has a lot of tools in its kit without the need of outside skill lines or sets. Like any build, however, there will always be some deficit that needs to be addressed, and in this case, it's the major critical buff, breach, and a lack of burst heal. I think this build could work if paired with Soul Cleaver for a 21% gain to siphoning damage, but outside of this, I can't imagine the damage would be high enough to pick off any kills. On this note, though, enemies would have a really difficult time catching you, and you could indefinitely streak with the Siphoning and Stormcalling pairing. It may be worth trying out if you're curious. The exercise that we just did together has been useful to a few friends of mine already, so I recommend you try this on your own, even if you're an experienced PvPer. Subclassing simply throws tomes of information at us, and we're expected to understand how everything connects to one another. Just make the process easier, slow it down, and just try an exercise like this, and your build will become stronger. The rest of the video will discuss every skill line to offer context to everything we just discussed. Be sure to review the timestamps in chapters to gather your bearings of where we're at with any point. And if you're familiar with a specific skill line, feel free to skip around, as each section is separated and only discusses specifics within that class and its interactions to others, rather than speaking to a longer conversation like my other videos. Aedric Spear features one of the most iconic spammables, Jabs. The skill received a potent buff to proc sundering more often, resulting in considerably higher damage. But given how inconsistent this ability is at hitting targets and the lack of ability to block cast, I don't think the skill is worth running in most cases outside 1vx environments or when with a group. The skill line has one of the best stuns in the game, being either more for the spear throw. This ability is unblockable and can guarantee other skills like Shocks or Merciless Resolve to land. Toppling Charge is a really strong gap close into stun, as well as offering major protection and setting the target off balance. If you have access to Aedric Spear and need a gap close, absolutely use this ability instead of the Spear Throw. Aedric Spear is a critical damage skill line, as seen by the first passive, Piercing Spear. The skill line also provides minor protection and minor berserk, as well as adding a pressure tool being Burning Light, but this passive requires a bit of maintenance to make the most out of. If you plan on using Aedric Spear to make the most out of its potential, you'll want to deal some amount of consistent damage to the target in order to continuously activate Burning Light. The skill line synergizes with any other damage line, like other critical damage-based skill lines like Animal Companions and Assassination, but also raw damage lines such as Stormcalling and Ardent Flame. If you're using the skill line, avoid items such as Malekiths, but gravitate towards the Monomyth Reforged. This line ties to the Etheric Lancer set and requires a baseline Templar to use. It offers a high burst with a bit of an offensive buff after the activation. On its own, the skill line does not offer enough damage to secure kills, so you'll want at least one additional damage line to make this more effective. Dawn's Wrath is a middle ground skill line between damage and survivability, granting us Power of the Light for delayed damage and Living Dark for a strong healing over time ability. For builds lacking Major Prophecy, Sunfire and its morphs offer a long dot that can be morphed into an AoE version or make it last longer. Solar Barrage can be paired with dot builds or pure Templars that utilize many class abilities for a raw damage increase. One of the staple abilities of any Templar was Radiant Destruction, but due to recent nerfs that make the beam dodgeable, this isn't typically run. Every ability in this list has a use within some builds, but the highlights from this skill line stem from both Power of the Light and Living Dark. For the passives, Prism will add a small amount of ultimate generation while in combat, and casting Dawn's Wrath abilities will activate the Illuminate passive, granting minor sorcery to you in the group. Because this skill line is more of a generalist line, the final passive offers a flat reduction to the cost of skills as well. The skill line works well for builds needing a delayed birth. Delayed birth? I don't know about that one.
Delayed birth.
Skill line works well for builds needing a delayed burst and a tool for survivability. Restoring Light is the defensive line from Templars and offers some of the best healing abilities in the game. For classes using Wield Soul as an offensive ability, they can use Honor the Dead for similar healing but at a much higher sustain. Players using the skill line also have access to Extended Ritual, an ability that cleanses many debuffs simultaneously as well as dropping a large healing over time effect on the floor. This not only helps yourself, but provides a synergy for your allies to cleanse debuffs as well, in addition to the healing them over time. Restoring Light's Resolve ability provides a healing over time effect that is amplified if stood in, as well as providing a high amount of magicka and stamina return that can be active even when a player is holding block. The passives of this line provide a raw increase to healing, minor mending, a small window of free blocking, and faster resurrections. None of these abilities require Restoring Light abilities to be slotted and will work regardless of which bar you're on. While healing over time is less important now to compare to lower damage metas, the skill line allows users to risk more health as any mistake will be passively healed away from Rune Focus or Extended Ritual. Moreover, while this skill line will not directly help you survive a one-shot by offering mitigation, receiving stamina while blocking drastically extends the duration one can block, thus allowing the user to mitigate far more damage from multiple sources. The skill line will work well with any build and rewards a playstyle trading mobility for defensives, and allowing a more brawler-style gameplay. To make the most out of this line, stand within your circles and place them around corners. For Sorcerer, we'll start with a Dark Magic skill line. This is a skill line that offers some burst and a lot of utility. Instead of carrying a singular identity, Dark Magic offers 5 unique skills that can enhance a build rather than be the focal point of reaching a win condition. Crystal Fragments is an ability that grants damage similar to a Spectral Bow, but with higher frequency. The other morph, Crystal Weapon, is used in builds relying on one-shot bursts, like gankers using Antlemer. In case it's a rooting ability that maims a target, the ability fell out of circulation with the release of Subclassing, but may find use in some niche setups. Rune Prison is a stun that can either be placed on your enemy or as a defensive rune on yourself that will stun an enemy when you're struck. While the stun cannot be blocked, it can be roll dodged, and with the rampant installation of Piercing Javelin in many players' builds, we're seeing more roll dodges than ever. If using Rune Cage, the ability is grayed out when it can't be used, like Fossilized from Earthen Heart, and can give new players an understanding of when the target is crowd controlled. Dark Exchange gives either magicka or stamina in addition to health and minor berserk. The sustain from the skill cannot be underestimated and can allow players to infinitely sustain, so long as the casting is not interrupted. The last ability is Daedric Mines, an ability widely overlooked by most, but clever gankers can use this to pull targets in to deal a devastating one-shot to their target. The skill line passives reduce the cost of your non-ultimate abilities, offer small heal when Crystal Fragments or Crystal Weapon hits, and grants minor prophecy to you and your group. As I mentioned earlier, I would not make a build around this skill line as it is a jack of all trades, but it can be used in a variety of setups across the spectrum. Unfortunately, the passives from this line fall way behind others, as the best builds create a purposeful outcome, but this line gives 4 unrelated passives, not bringing your build to be the best at anything. Dark magic highlights the issue of having powerful skills, but underperforming passives, which results in a lack of popularity. Daedric summoning has its place within pet builds where the goal is to hide behind your pets so that they take the damage for you while passively dispensing their own. The Scamp in Twilight accomplishes this goal with a Scamp offering AoE damage in the stun and a Twilight and or Clanifear giving a burst heal. Conjured Ward no longer heals its users, and while I see some sorcerers clinging onto the past and using this, I always see this as a wasted ability activation and ability slot when fighting them. On builds where stacking higher hit points matters, however, the shield scales really well, and can be used with Bone Goliath or Vampire Hole. Daedric Curse and its morphs offer some of the strongest delayed damage in the game, and is easier to aim than Deep Fissure. The ability isn't enough to justify running the skill line, but when paired with Bound Armor or Armaments, the choice can be a bit more appealing. Bound Armor and Armaments offer either defensive or offensive bonuses that can act as a passive. It's important to note that Armaments can be activated, though fighting with this ability and opponents using this against me, I was never afraid of the damage it would deal, especially in comparison to a similar ability like Merciless Resolve. ZOS backstepped a few of their changes just before launch, giving some of the non-pet power back, but these line passives are simply weak when compared to other lines. Rebate gives a bit of Magicka and Stamina back, but its return can't compare to any other line that offers Sustain. Power Stone, however, is useful in offering a high amount of ultimate reduction cost, and builds using ultimates frequently will benefit from this line. Daedric Protection can be a decent effect that persists when your Daedric summoning abilities are active, and can't be dismissed as useless. The last passive, Expert Summoner, gives some max Magicka and Stamina, and if a pet is active, provides a bit of health as well. As a whole, Daedric Summoning is picked up for its delayed burst and strong passive for the back bar, but the passives from this line don't often justify running this. For someone who plans on running pets in PvP, the passives make sense, but outside of this build type, you're better off running different skill lines. Stormcalling is one of the most popular options as of Update 46, as the tools it offers are not only diverse, but each strong in their own category. The class Execute Mage's Wrath received a sizable nerf to its duration, now only lasting 2 seconds. Either morph is strong in their own regard, but the AoE cleave from this in group settings is especially potent. Stormcalling also has a resolve skill, with the secondary effect being a speed bonus and a damage over time. Critical Surge provides major sorcery, as well as healing when critical damage is dealt. In previous patches, the healing from the skill was more impactful as burst was lower, meaning healing over time effects impacted survivability to a higher degree. On top of the Execute and Resolve, the line also has access to the best mobility in the game, Streak, which allows targets to escape fights with ease. When paired with a line like Siphoning, users can sustain an indefinite period of streaking away to or from a location. The skill line's ultimate, Overload, is seeing less use within the current meta as other ultimates synergize better with the one-shot win condition that has recently become popularized, though its strength and consistent high pressure remains an optimal choice. Stormcalling has one passive for some sustain, though it isn't much, but 3 separate passives for raw damage output, increasing physical and shock damage, in addition to Amplitude, a passive that increases damage done against high health targets. Because the fastest path to damage is to deal a succession of burst near simultaneously, the raw damage increases from this line, in conjunction with the mobility, Resolve, and Execute, makes Stormcalling an offensive skill line that still checks the boxes off of our list of necessary components to a build. In every environment, the line is strong, but especially in open world settings where mobility is crucial. Stormcalling is versatile and is usable in both dot and burst builds. Ardent Flame is a dot-based skill line that's stable across any dot build. The skill line offers dots with secondary effects, like applying Breach, the poison status effect, or healing, and is spammable that can deal a decent amount of damage. The skill line is similar to the dot equivalent of Stormcalling, as it offers fire and poison damage instead of shock and physical. This is a skill line that performs decently on its own, but especially when the build revolves around this line. I've discussed the pairings in previous videos, but to regurgitate a bit, the more dots that are applied, the stronger dots are. I've seen some players add some burst with this line, like using Aedric Spear for the stun and Crescent Sweep to supplement this and to create higher pressure. Another line pairing for this that goes well is Gravelord for Blast Bones, as any dot is a comparison of your DPS versus your opponent's HPS, and defiling gives you a huge advantage. Draconic Power offers strong defensive options and some amount of offensive power as well. Starting with Spiked Armor, this is Dragonite's access to Resolve, and while not as strong as other Resolve skills, the damage shield or dot effect can impact your survivability and damage done to either buy you time or close in your kill window. Burning Talons is an immobilize skill that adds strong and fast dots to your enemy, acting more as a pressure tool than a crowd control. Dragon Blood and its morphs remain one of the strongest heals in the game, but especially on builds utilizing high maximum hit points, as Coagulating Blood will positively scale with this. Running this would allow Wield Soul to be used as an offensive spammable, but this disallows burst healing to allies. Protective Scale is an okay defensive option. In previous patches, the skill had more strength, but the snare immunity and ranged protection proved useful in open world environments. One of the highlights of the skill line, however, comes from the delayed burst of Inhale. If you pair with Corrosive and Mechanical Acuity, the AoE delayed burst from this can be especially powerful with another ability like Shocks. While a lot of subclassing options are subjected to direct comparison between itself and other like abilities, Draconic Power's abilities are unique and should be tailored to, rather than to supplement to most generalist builds. Because of this, Draconic Power operates better under a specialist build, playing to the precise wording of each ability. The ultimate ability, Take Flight, is similar to Crescent Sweep with its damage output per ultimate point cost ratio, but also has the additional effect of giving a free global cooldown of damage for the knockback animation needing to finish before players can take an action. The passives also lean into this idea, but rather than applying to a range of specialists, appeal stronger towards a more defensive playstyle. The passives provide bonuses to blocking and healing. Earthen Heart is a line most players avoid within subclassing, as unfortunately there's not much the skill line offers except for two exceptionally strong abilities. The ultimate, Corrosive Armor, gives 100% penetration and a huge damage reduction while active, allowing for players to turn and burn targets in any PvP setting. Corrosive was always a staple of Dragonite, but now that any class can pick it up, I expect to see a lot more players using this ultimate with other burst sets like Mechanical Acuity or even just Order's Wrath. The other strong skill is Petrify, with either morph offering their use. Like Piercing Javelin from Aedric's Spear, the ability is unblockable, but it actually has an advantage over this ability as it's also undodgeable. Against most players, the difference is almost unnoticeable, but competent players can predict the spear throw and avoid the burst, thus making Petrify the stronger stun. The passives for Earthen Heart are solid and can be applied to most any generalist build. Battle Roar will restore resources when ulting, and while this received a sizable nerf within Update 46, the sustain from this passive is still worth considering to run, or at least a bonus on top of already selecting the skill line. By selecting Earthen Heart, you'll also receive 10% more weapon damage and some ultimate, as well as a bit of stamina when casting the class's skills. If you're a burst setup and you're lacking penetration or want to bomb, Earthen Heart is worth picking up just for Corrosive alone. General setups can also benefit from this versatile passives and access to the strongest stun in the game that grants a large advantage to the user. For Warden, Animal Companions finds its place in many PvPers' tier lists for its many boons that come with it. Deep Fissure is a delayed burst that applies both breaches and hits comparably to Haunting Curse or Power of the Light, but also cleaves many targets when it activates. Lining up the ability can be a bit tricky, but once you're accustomed to the skill's range and timing, you'll find that your camera naturally aligns with the target and allows the ability to land. Range users won't benefit from this ability much, however, and I recommend selecting a different skill line just because of this. The Betting Netch and its morphs are strong, providing major sorcery and brutality, 200 stamina and magic per second, and occasionally cleansing debuffs on you. The final active ability on this line is to discuss Falcon Swiftness and its morphs. The ability provides either minor evasion or berserk and cleanses snares while granting minor expedition. While Streak from Stormcalling is deemed to be the strongest mobility option, if you pair this skill with Swift trait on your jewelry or gap clothes, you'll find your maneuverability to be exceptional and can easily evade large groups of players. The active abilities for the skill line are strong, but this is only half the picture. The passives from Animal Companions are some of the strongest in the game, granting 20% more recoveries, up to 30% more critical damage, a bit of ultimate gain, and healing when one of your Animal Companions' ability ends. Per that last point, activating Netch will constantly cleanse debuffs and heal you because an ability ended. This allows players to receive free healing during periods when one can recover resources. The skill line synergizes well with raw damage skill lines, but especially other critical damage lines like Aedric Spear and Assassination. The skill line offers 1 damage over time and applies minor vuln, but Animal Companion seems to be tailored towards burst-heavy style, so I recommend using it for those type of setups. Because my channel focuses on information to promote generalist builds rather than specific setups like healers, I won't cover too much about Green Balance and other healing lines from the DLC classes. There is one point I'd like to discuss, however, that being minor toughness granted from the maturation passive. The current meta diminishes the importance of healing over time abilities and instead favors an increase to maximum effective hit points. In one of my future videos, I will cover this more in depth, but essentially builds should prioritize higher mitigation and higher hit points to survive larger bursts. The passive adds 10% hit points and distances your health bar from entering the Fatal Zone, which grants you larger offensive windows. Winter's Embrace was comparable to other defensive lines prior to Update 46, but specialty builds gravitate towards this for a few reasons. To begin, Frostcloak is potent for group play in its ability to share Major Resolve with all players. If you're in a group of 4, you've freed up 3 ability slots for your team, allowing Execute, Snares, Stuns, and other types of abilities to be run, and the strength of this feature only grows with the more players. Polar Wind is a heal that scales with maximum hit points, so players choosing this route should highly consider the skill line for this ability alone, even if Major Resolve is already sourced from another line. Although it's seen nerfs in recent patches, the healing from this ability still stands against its alternative, Coagulating Blood, and is widely considered to be the stronger of the two options. The final active skill to discuss is Shimmering Shield for granting major heroism and ultimate generation. Players using expensive ultimates like Corrosive or the in-skill line ultimate Northern Storm can build towards their bursts much quicker and provides heavy resistance against the merciless resolves that we're seeing most players run. The ultimate ability, Northern Storm, is a devastating area of effect that works especially well with Balorg and Mechanical Acuity, even if your build is tank heavy. The passives of this line draw one towards inflicting more frost damage and gives resistances per Winter's Embrace ability slotted. One interesting note is the application of Major Maim, which is a debuff not often applied in PvP but is very useful. For Nightblade, Assassination finds its place towards one of the most desirable skill lines within subclassing, as this is the epitome of damage. Starting with the first skill, both morphs of Veiled Strike have their uses, but Surprise Attack has a far more burst in a much shorter window. The reasoning for this may fall under the realm of exploiting, so I'm not going to go into detail or personally participate in this feature. But if you're curious as to how someone drops your HP very quickly with just a skill, there is a reason behind this. The gap closed from the line is mediocre and saw some use prior to subclassing, but still finds itself useful in bomber builds. The class Execute, while being strong numerically speaking, with outside burst being so high and bar space being especially restrictive, finding this ability in a death recap isn't common. Mark Target is a decent option for Breach, though this isn't the most desirable way to do so. Grim Focus, and specifically its morph Merciless Resolve, are one of the strongest abilities across every skill line, and can drop an enemy's hit points at such a speed, comparisons almost seem unfair. With Update 46, players can sack this ability twice, adding pressure and burst that pair well with delayed bursts from other classes. To summarize the passives, Assassination grants high crit chance and critical damage and a bit more critical chance when you're behind the target. The line alone can carry a build's damage to be acceptable, but when this is used with another critical or raw damage line, the lethality of this setup jumps leagues ahead of what it was previously in PvP. The standouts from the Shadow line are vastly different that depends on your perspective of what the class line is built for. On one hand, the line can be viewed as a way for gankers and bombers to safely enter and exit fights by using invisibility from Shadowing Disguise, but also teleporting using Shade. The other viewpoint indicates that this class is shining the most if using Dark Cloak, a heal that scales with maximum hit points. On the right build, the ability can make a tank nearly unkillable. Blur grants major evasion for builds that desire this but aren't able to run Quick Cloak from dual wield, or evasion for medium armor, but this line isn't worth just acquiring for this alone. The passives encourage the tankier style of this utilization by providing a large increase to maximum hit points, granting major resolve, and a small increase to all recoveries. The usefulness of Shadow is dependent on your build, but view this as a specialist line rather than a generalist. Most builds won't be able to make use out of many of the actives and passives that Shadow provides, but gankers, bombers, and tanks should consider this as one of their top options. If you're a tank that has minor toughness and using an ultimate like Bone Goliath, you can easily reach over the 100,000 hit points, which impacts skills like damage shields and some heal. To explain the power of what high hit points does and how it scales with abilities would require a separate video, but be on the lookout for the future. The Siphoning line supports the various parts that make up a build, ranging from dots, hots, snares, and sustain. The first skill, Strife, should be morphed into Swallow Soul to provide a short window of high pressure, while also healing oneself for a portion of the damage provided. If you're Nightblade using the Soul Cleaver set, this is one of the best abilities to use, as it continually widens your offensive window by pressuring your opponent while keeping your hit points high. Crippling Grasp offers some burst damage with a dot and a mobilize tied to it as well. One of the highlights from the actives of Siphoning is Siphoning Strikes, an ability that trades health for magic when activated, and passively provides some of the highest sustain in the game. Drain Power is an ability that seems to have fallen off the radar for most players since Update 46, as while this is a strong debuff and buff, ability slots feel more scarce than ever right now, as instead of working within the limitations of your base class, you must also consider if the slot is being optimally filled when compared to abilities from other skill lines. The passives from Siphoning all point to generating ultimate at a really fast pace. Previously, Nightblade was the best class to reach high ultimate quickly and was utilized in endgame groups to use sets like Pillager's Prophet. In PvP, when paired with major and minor heroism, as well as Bloodspawn and the decisive trait, the time to reach maximum ultimate is drastically reduced, in part just because of Siphoning. Builds requiring constant usage of their ultimate should, without a doubt, include this line as a non-negotiable. Builds that don't explicitly have the objective to generate maximum ultimate, however, can still utilize this factor and should lean into this if they're finding sustain to be an issue. Bro, we have so many people right now. The Gravelord skill line is provided by bombers and pressure players, but most of the skills go unutilized. I would avoid using the Skull Spammable and its morphs as it does minimal damage and doesn't grant any buffs or debuffs. Blastbones finds itself on the opposite side of viability and is not only a strong delayed damage ability, but also grants major and minor defile, removing 24% of an enemy's incoming healing. As covered in previous videos, dot and pressure builds should aim to include defile in their setup, and Blastbone seems to be the perfect ability to do so. Boneyard sees some use with its debuffs, though with the introduction of subclassing, I don't see this ability run very often. The Mage or Archer can provide some damage as well, and builds requiring major sorcery may find this ability worth a slot. The final ability, Siphon, grants major prophecy, a buff rarely found within these class skill lines. While this might seem like a simple critical damage buff, one must consider that sourcing from this skill allows users to use tri-stat recovery potions, which most builds should aim for, as all stats are constantly used during a fight. The ability also provides a 3% damage increase, which isn't entirely noticeable in most cases, but good to have nonetheless. Gravelord's passives support a dot-style gameplay, with increased damage over time, but also applies to pressure builds that need penetration and critical strike chance. Gravelord is best used when paired with other damage over time effects like skills that come from Ardent line, but can also be combined with Burst by Nightblade. The line grants some of the best pressure found in the game, most of which comes from just Blastbones. If you're someone who wants to use dots in PvP, this is one of my first recommendations to you. Bombers and Burst can also use this line to use Colossus and Blastbones as pressuring tools, though this is less common in generalist builds and more so found in just bombing. Living Death is the Necromancer's healing line. Unfortunately, many of these abilities are strictly outclassed when compared to every similar skill. Spirit Mender used to be a staple for Necromancers, but I've yet to meet a single player who deems this skill line to be better than others, like Restoring Light or Green Balance. If you disagree and find just justification for this, please let me know in the comments. There is a case for the Resurrection Ultimate within open world environments, so this isn't to say the entire line is terrible. I've witnessed this ability used to great effects, to flip fights quickly where one team will ult dump another, just for a healer to resurrect all of them and do the same back to them. Hey, it's Ryder from the future. Apparently I didn't record my Bone Tyrant line, so here it is. Bone Tyrant is a line I wouldn't recommend to generalist builds, so I won't spend a lot of time discussing the ability lineup. The skill line offers damage reduction and health passives, and skills that generate corpses and ultimates. This isn't to say the skill has no use, but in fact finds itself as a staple within high hit point builds. In a future video, I'm going to cover the strength of maximum hit points, an idea that is more prevalent now with the high damage meta, but the ultimate Bone Goliath strengthens the size of your damage shields, and this applies to the ones you cast on allies too. For builds achieving interactions with a higher HP pool, absolutely consider the skill line. Before I close out the line though, I want to mention the strength of Bone Totem and its morphs. The AoE Fear works similar to Warden's Charm in that it places an area of denial that stuns enemies after a delay. For players wanting a similar feature but don't want to be a base class Warden using a script, this is an alternative, but it is a bit weaker. Arcanist finds itself in a really weird spot in the meta, and it kind of has been since its release. Arcanist Herald of the Tome should be used in a completely different way than in PvE. While you can hypothetically use Fake Cover to damage enemies, this strategy is only really effective if someone is not looking at you. And in any generalist setup not incorporating high amount of mobility or invisibility, you become an easy target. The ability can deal high amounts of damage, however, so if properly built around with high defensives, the ability could work, but you'd have to commit a lot of your build to this. Abyssal Impact and its morphs immobilize the enemy and place a unique flat damage taken buff on them, and is comparable to Solar Barrage from Dawn's Wrath. Immobilizes, in my opinion, are a greatly underutilized tool, even in duels, as you can force an opponent to use a global cooldown to roll dodge or that they sit still, allowing ground-based abilities to hit with higher consistency. But it also allows you to position around them to flank, preventing incoming damage and activating the Nightblade flanking passive. One of the real strengths from this class line comes from Inspired Scholarship, which will activate its damage when using a class ability. Evo444 on YouTube demonstrated this with a recent Templar Sword Arcanist ganker. Check out their channel for a demonstration. They make great and unique videos that focus on specialized builds. The ability also grants major sorcery, which may allow for a diverse pool of potions to be used. The passives are interesting, and I had a hard time grouping them together. Fated Fortune grants critical healing and damage if you interact with the Crux minigame, but for builds not utilizing Crux, this passive only has a small impact on your performance. Harnessed Quintessence gives a bit of recovery, and Splintered Secrets gives a bit of penetration. The true power of Arcanist passives lies within Psychic Lesion, granting higher status effect chance and damage. Historically, Arcanists have been able to use damage over time sets such as Serpent Sustain to greatly benefit from this passive. If you pair this with Ardent Flame or Gravelord and equip Serpent Sustain, you can roll out many damaging effects that Templars and Wardens will fail to keep up with. Absolutely consider this skill line if the dot playstyle works for you. Soldier of Apocrypha offers one of the best tanking lines with raw damage mitigation, but also scarce buffs and debuffs. Starting with the class taunts, either Morph grants a 2% damage reduction per Crux active, which, when scaled with other mitigations, can prevent large amounts of damage, especially from other players. I'll just redo that part. Soldier of Apocrypha offers one of the best tanking lines for raw mitigation, but also some scarce debuffs and effects. Starting with the class taunt, either Morph grants a 2% damage per reduction. Soldier of Apocrypha offers one of the best tanking lines for raw mitigation, but also some scarce buffs and debuffs. Starting with the class taunt, either Morph grants a 2% damage reduction per Crux active, which, when scaled with other mitigations, can prevent large amounts of damage. Moreover, one Morph can apply Lifesteal, and the other applies Armor Steal from an opponent. Both morphs are okay on their own, but the Armor Steal beats out just a bit more, as mitigation is currently more important than maximizing healing over time. The damage shield from this line scales with maximum hit points, so builds using this as a tool of survival should consider running either Morph of Rootspite Ward. One version gives Magicka Sustain, and the other splits the shield's strength, granting a higher burst of mitigation in the beginning. Fate Woven Armor is the line's Resolve ability, which has morphs that greatly depend on your win condition. If your goal is to permablock and survive against many enemies for as long as possible, Unbreakable Fate gives block mitigation. Crux Weaver, the other morph, gives Crux occasionally and can fuel other abilities with the skill line. Runic Defense grants minor protection and a heal that scales off of maximum hit points and can either grant more HP or crowd control immunity. Colorless Pool can apply Brittle, a debuff that is rarely found outside of full frost builds, and can be seen as a large damage increase against the target. Because most players are running the Monomyth, the vulnerability part of this ability isn't that strong, but the undodgeability of this is, acting similar to Fossilize. The passives from this line aren't anything special, with a bit of armor, recovery, minor evasion, and a small passive of ultimate gain. For builds using high armor and plan to use cutting defense, then this option could be okay with other tank lines, but I wouldn't say this is the figurative spearhead of any optimal build. Like other healing lines, I won't go into a lot of detail about Curative Runeforms. Most of the abilities are useful in PvE, but fall short in PvP. Builds stacking high amounts of damage shields greatly benefit from chakrams, but also the passive ability that strengthens them by 10% and reduces their cost by the same amount. This can be surprisingly game-changing in builds that stack damage shields and can justify running this as one of your 3 skill lines, as long as damage shields are part of your win condition. Truthfully, I've never spent any amount of time using this line in PvP, so my knowledge on this is less than ideal. I might be missing out on crucial interaction here. If you've made it this far, I commend you on your attention span in an era of brain rot. The video took a while to create and required additional research to complete. I know I spoke pretty fast, so I apologize if that was too much. If you found anything helpful, please let me know, as I'm curious what gaps of knowledge players might have within PvP and subclassing in general. My future content will be shorter, as I wanted my first few videos to operate as cohesive indexes of information rather than splitting everything across many videos. Thank you for watching, and remember to tell your friends and family that you appreciate them.